Who here likes jokes? Hi, I'm Dr. Erika Sigurdson, and welcome to Making History. You may have noticed, if you've been watching my videos, that I've been posting videos a lot less frequently lately. I'll be honest, I have been a little bit, down in the last few months, and finding it harder to stay motivated. So apologies for that more sporadic posting. But anyway, that being said, I kind of feel like I need to talk about something a little bit more fun, a little bit light, and remind myself why I love the Middle Ages so much. And maybe some of you were equally in the mood for something, a little bit fun, a little bit easy, and a reminder of how weird and wonderful the past can be. So I thought now would be a good time for us to dive into a text that I actually only learned about a little while ago, but have been fascinated by and really excited to do a video about ever since I did. This text is called The Facetiae, which means like short, funny jokes or anecdotes. The book was written by Poggio, a papal bureaucrat and scholar from the early 15th century. He is remembered as an early humanist scholar and also as a collector of classical manuscripts. He's credited actually with discovering and, saving the only known manuscript of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. And if you're underwhelmed by that, you're like, I don't know what that means. A very popular book that I have not read, called The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt, makes the argument that this act, Poggio's rediscovery of the De Rerum Natura, is the key moment, the swerve that changed the course of history and created the modern world. I haven't read the book, but I'm generally a bit skeptical of these big, sweeping series of history. But anyway, that's not the point. What is clear is that Poggio's own writing and his manuscripts that he collected, and even his handwriting, actually, believe it or not, were unquestionably all very influential pieces in the early Italian Renaissance. But do you know which of his many erudite writings was the most immediately popular in his time? Let's take a guess. You're right, it's the joke book, with hundreds of jokes and short, funny anecdotes and stories. That is what people like to read. So for today, what I want to do is analyze very seriously and in great detail one of Poggio's dirtier jokes. So maybe about 15 or 20% of the jokes and funny stories in this book are extremely dirty. And I'll be honest, I personally find them the most interesting aspect of the work. Well, one of two very interesting aspects of the work. I like Poggio, and I like his joke book because he has this very clear, very strong point of view. He wears his biases openly, and I enjoy that. So while I do really like his sex jokes, I actually think the thing I like about the text maybe the most is his open and to me kind of funny disdain for Dominican friars. He hates them. I don't know why, but he does, and it's great. But before I dive fully into the main topic for today, I did want to give you a taste of some of the other content of this joke book. And especially, I want to talk about some of the jokes that don't actually work today. So Poggio includes a number of what I imagine to be kind of political jokes or stories poking fun at public figures of the day. So for me, these jokes are just baffling because I don't know the context. However, even without that context, they still provide us some great insights into the society and culture that Poggio was living in and his own mindset, his mentality. So for instance, here's a joke supposedly told by Dante, as in the Dante of Dante's Inferno, which already, I think that's great. Dante was once seated for dinner between the older and younger Can Grande. So for the joke to work, you need to know, first of all, that the Can Grandes were people, and secondly, that the word Can Grande means big dog, okay? When their servants intentionally tried to hurt him by secretly throwing bones at his feet. When the table was removed, everyone turned towards Dante and wondered why there were bones in front of him only. To which, you ready for the punchline? Dante, always prepared with an answer, replied, "It is little wonder if the dogs have eaten their bones, but I am not a dog." Do you get it? I don't get it. I know it's not funny. It doesn't work. I mean, maybe it did at the time, but I don't get it. Okay, it doesn't work for me. Maybe it works for you, I don't know. But I don't have the context. You'd really have to research things like, okay, who exactly are the Can Grandes, and what was their beef with Dante. And what about Poggio? So the title of this joke is A Witty Reply, but I just don't have enough context to know if Poggio means that seriously. Like, he genuinely thinks this is a witty comeback, or is it meant to be like ironic, like a dig at Dante? I have no idea. But even without that context, we can learn a few things about this joke, right? Like, obviously, in the world of this joke, which we have to imagine is the world of 15th century Italy, dropping bones on the floor during a meal is obviously shameful, right? It's bad table manners. And this is interesting to me, we'll notice that in Renaissance Italy, we're still in this world of moving tables, right? So when they talk about the servants, they drop the bones, and then when they move the tables, that's when everyone noticed that the bones were all at his feet. So I know this. In medieval castles, people ate in a big room called the Great Hall, essentially on folding tables and benches. And between the meals, the tables and benches would be removed. They picked them up and put them to the side. And the Great Hall would be used for other purposes during the day and for sleeping, sometimes at night. So here in this joke, we can see that same practice at play. Isn't that cool? So that's just one little example of what we can learn about this long gone society from a joke I personally don't really get, or at least don't really think is that funny. And there's so much we can learn when we get to the kind of material that we don't see very often talked about or written about and preserved when it was written about. Do you know what I'm talking about? Dirty jokes. The dirty jokes from this volume are a great opportunity to get a peek at popular attitudes towards sex, and sometimes at these very intimate details that wouldn't otherwise be recorded because that's not the kind of thing you write about. So that's what I want to focus on today. But also, one of the major roadblocks that can get in the way of understanding these dirty jokes, namely pussy-footed translators, which is not a dirty, it's not dirty. It's not a dirty word. It's an old word, but it's not dirty. Okay, but first, there's one final bit of biographical detail about Poggio, our author, that is relevant for our current purposes. Well, two things. Okay, the first is that Poggio spent over 50 years of his life working as a high-ranking papal administrator. And his roles included being the personal secretary to the Pope, which involved things like taking dictation and writing up formal letters from the Pope in Latin, which is also the language of this joke book. And we are going to talk a little bit more about the language and translation kind of stuff around this book. But the second thing I want to highlight about Poggio's life is that at the time he was writing and publishing his joke book, Poggio was, and I think he would enjoy and agree with this assessment, kind of a dirty old man. In 1436, at the age of 56, he left his long-term mistress and, with her, 14 children that they had had together so that he could marry an 18-year-old from a good Florentine family. And when all his friends told him that the age gap was like maybe just a little too much and maybe kind of a bad idea, instead of listening to them, he clapped back by publishing a diatribe about it called Whether an Old Man Should Marry. I haven't read it yet, but oh my goodness, I want to. And the two of them, by the way, Poggio and his younger wife, had 6 more children. So basically what I'm trying to say is he had a large amount of practical knowledge on which he was basing at least some of his dirty stories, which, ew, by the way, ew. So gross. So now, let's talk about translations. So like I said, the Facetiae are written in Latin by a scholar and a bureaucrat who had, the highest level of Latin learning and knowledge, and who applied this to sex jokes. But my Latin's not good enough to always get the full effect of erudite sex jokes. And unless you're a papal scholar, I'm guessing yours isn't either. So we have to rely on our translator to convey some of that linguistic styling, the stuff going on. However, unfortunately, the only English translation that I'm aware of the full volume was published in 1879 by an anonymous translator. There are translations of snippets that are available online. So for instance, that joke, the Dante joke we did earlier, is published by the Medieval Source Book. you can see the Latin and the English, and I think I'll put a link to that in the description. And there is a more recent edition and translation of, I believe, the whole volume into French that was published in 2005. But unfortunately, I couldn't get a hold of it, and it's in French. But the 1879 edition, because it's out of copyright, you can find the whole thing online very easily. So it's very accessible. However, it's also a very old translation. But why does that matter? It's an old book. So there's two reasons why it matters. The first reason is specific to the racy material. Victorian morality is very much a thing, and it was very difficult to publish unexpurgated editions or translations of any text with overtly sexual or scatological elements, which, by the way, the joke book has both. So it was common for texts to be what we call boulderized, which is a term that comes from a terrible 1818 edition of the works of Shakespeare, which the editor, Thomas Boulder, reworked to make them more suitable for women and children. You can imagine what that might sound like. Honestly, it's remarkable that this joke book was published at all, with the sexual humor intact, especially given how easy it would have been to remove those jokes. But as we'll see, the translator had to make a lot of adjustments to make that. And the second problem with older translations, which is not specific to the dirty stuff, is that we get a text that has been translated not just into English, but into 19th century English. And if you've read anything written in the 19th century, you kind of know what I mean. The language is just different from what we would use today, and it can be really hard for the modern reader to then tell the difference or pick apart the difference between the outdated language of the translation or the outdated language of the original. Now, since the second point is more subtle, I want to get into it in a more concrete way by looking at one dirty joke in particular, okay? So I'm going to start by reading the anecdote in full in the original translation. Apologies, because that does mean I'm going to be using a fairly derogatory term for a sex worker in the process. But here I go. A whore one day came before them being this sort of tribunal, and complained of the injury and detriment caused to her by a barber. She had sent for him whilst in her bath to have her lower parts shaved, and he had cut her so badly that for several days she had been unable to follow her avocation. In consequence, she charged him with having occasioned her a great prejudice, and sued him for compensation of the profits he had caused her to lose. Do you hear the Victorian in it? Notice some of the word choices, avocation, detriment, whilst. We don't really use those words much anymore. And beyond individual word choice, notice the cadence, the rhythm of the sentences in the paragraph itself. Not by accident that I sort of almost want to put on this accent reading it out. It sounds like it was written and meant to be spoken by some gentleman scholar with big mutton chops. And this might sound obvious, but I want to say explicitly that I don't read this paragraph as generic, ye old-timey language. To me, it reads very specifically as 19th century English. And it would sound just a little bit different if the translation had been done in 1779 instead of 1879, or 1679, or 1579, or 1979, It can sometimes be easy to hear, oh, that sounds old, but we need to be more specific. But why does that matter? And it matters, actually, especially in the context here of medieval literature, or in this case, Renaissance literature, because A, we're almost always relying on translations of these texts, and B, because a lot of these translations were written around the same time as this one. So that Victorian period, or mid to late 19th century. There are a lot of reasons for this, and I actually talked a bit more about the Victorian fascination with the Middle Ages in a previous video, which you can check out after this one. But one consequence of this is that reading these translations now, 150 years later, we run the risk of thinking that the old-fashioned sounding Victorian language is what the Middle Ages, or Renaissance in this case, actually sounded like. And I want to be clear, they didn't. So this is why I want to look briefly at the original Latin of the story to show you how different it actually sounds like. But don't worry, don't be scared by the Latin. I promise we won't test you or anything. And I want to use this analysis to make two more specific points about the translation, and then we can move on and talk about how we can use little stories like this in social or cultural history. Okay, so I'm going to try, no promises, because I don't know if I can actually do this, but I'm going to try to put the Latin text up on the screen so you can read along with me. So I want you to focus on the core of the story, starting with, she had sent for him whilst in her bath. So my first question mark when I read this translation was the phrase, to have her lower parts shaved by the barber. To me, that sounds like a euphemism. And one thing I know about Victorians, and we find it a lot in this translation, they like a euphemism. But do you know what? I was wrong. The Latin reads the same, ut partes inferiorem raderet, in order that he might shave her lower parts. It's the same. It's the same euphemism. And actually, so I consulted for this project a spectacular book, which I highly recommend, published in 1982, called The Latin Sexual Vocabulary. And the Latin Sexual Vocabulary from 1982 tells us that partes inferiorum was a euphemism for the downstairs bits from Roman times. So that's very pleasing. Okay, but don't worry. My hunch that we're getting some euphemistic language and some weird stuff in the translation is still not wrong. And if we look at the next section, here's where it really kicks in. So in translation, again, we have, and he had cut her so badly that for several days she had been unable to follow her avocation. Okay, so I want to take that in two parts. The first part, he had cut her so badly that. Now in the Latin, we find rasorio ita cuni partem incidet. And the key word here is one that shows up a lot in this book, shows up a lot in the dirty jokes of this book. And our poor translator has a terrible time with every single time. Cuni here is the genitive of cunis, which, like our anonymous translator, I'm not sure I'm ready to say out loud on the internet. But the whole section should be, I think, that barber cut a part of her cunis, which honestly I find viscerally upsetting. Like, ow, that hurts so much just to hear it. So we move on to the second part. For several days, she had been unable to follow her avocation. She's a sex worker. Here again, this sounds like a euphemism because we know what this woman's avocation is. And honestly, the Latin original is so much better than the euphemistic workaround. We have ut pluribus diebus homines admittere nequiviset. Ugh. No one knows how to pronounce Latin. I don't know how to pronounce Latin. Or such that for many days, pluribus diebus, she, or maybe it, was unable to, that's the nequiviset, admittere, sort of let in, admit, or receive, homines, men. I love it. This is a much more direct and also, in my opinion, much funnier way of saying what we're trying to say. So overall, just to recap, I think a more literal translation of this section might read, that barber cut a part of her such that, or so badly that, for several days she was unable to receive men, but with a bit of a double entendre in there where she was unable to receive men could also be read as it, as in the body part, was unable to let men in. Now, one thing I want us to be really careful of is not to be obnoxious and self-righteous and assume that the worst of the original translator. I don't know this for sure, of course, but it's my very strong sense that he knew this literal translation full well. Like, he wasn't just making a mistake or being a bad translator, probably. Coming back to that first issue I was talking about, the bowdlerization or editing out the dirty bits, you can see all through this text that our translator is struggling to find workarounds for these dirty jokes and for the language, especially for that C word, in ways that would be printable in 1897. In a number of places, he actually deals with the problem by just leaving the bad words in Latin. And now that you've learned a new Latin word, you'll have no problem, for instance, understanding the name of a story that he translates as a dolt who believed his wife had duos kunos. That's a particularly spicy one, actually. And there's also some places where he uses the classic F word approach, where he just replaces the dirty words with a dash or the first letter in dash. So D ... N for damn, or F ... D for, you get the idea. And here, he's taken this third option of kind of just making the translation kind of loose to avoid the problem altogether. And in some ways, I actually really like his choice at the end to go with that unable to follow her avocation. Even though it is quite far from being an accurate or literal word for word translation, I kind of think it does a good enough job of capturing the humor of the original, but without getting into blue territory. But that's a matter of opinion. Whether you think it was a good choice or not, this is why it's important to be able to check with the original to understand just how much the translator has been making decisions and how much translators affect how we read and understand a translated text. So I hope I've been able to highlight just some of the challenges and the pitfalls of relying on translations, and especially older. This doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. This 19th century translation is great, actually. It gives us the English and Latin side by side so we can easily check it ourselves, and it's very accessible and free on the internet. And that's a big deal. We just have to be aware of the context of the translation as much as we are aware of the context of the original work, and keep both in mind. And I hope you've been able to see and think about what we can learn about the culture and the society of Renaissance Italy from these seemingly, crude and insignificant little stories. We can learn a lot about sexuality in the past from looking at the dirty jokes people tell. So in this story, we get an amazing insight into a practice that I personally have never seen evidence of before, namely the downstairs grooming habits of Renaissance sex workers. And now I'm not so much surprised that they removed hair. That doesn't surprise me. But I'm fascinated by the implication of how they removed that hair. The idea of having a professional and presumably male barber come to your bath and shave your lower parts, that I find amazing. I want to know more. Is this a private bath in a private home or a public bathhouse? Were there specialized barbers for women and women's shaving needs? Or was this guy doing like beards and bits? It's amazing, right? And it's not even the point of the joke. The person telling this joke, Poggio, didn't even think about all these questions that this raises for me about intimate shaving practices, because to him, that wasn't the point. And isn't that great? We can learn so much about the past, or in this case, raise questions about the past, from these casual asides, from material that the person writing the story was not interested in, because to them it was just normal. I love it. I love it so much. There's so much more we could say about this. And I didn't even get to talking about Poggio's views on women and sexuality, which are fascinating, or his jokes about old men and their sex lives, which are equally fascinating. But I hope I have given you just a bit of an insight into the possibilities of what we can learn from dirty old men's jokes and the challenges of translation and understanding them in a sex-negative culture. Anyway, I hope this was fun. I enjoyed it. If you like this video and want to see more, remember to like, subscribe, and share so that it can be seen by more people. I'm Dr. Erika Sigurdson. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, stay curious, do good history. Okay, bye-bye.